Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. Isis, Escape from Transylvania. The goddess next door and John Haynes must escape a horde of vampires on the hunt in this horror-filled Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Escape from Transylvania in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. I was watching a Just Some Guy video where he asked the question, why are Black Mass comics so political? And when it comes down to comic publishers like your Black Mask, like your Marvel, and even your DC to a point, oftentimes you have comic book creators who believe that they have to make some sort of political statement in between the pages of their comics. And because they believe they have to make this political statement, this is why your comics are so filled with heavy politics. However, when it comes down to many of these comic book professionals, I believe that many of them really do not understand the comic book medium, nor do they understand the history of the American comic book. Now, when it comes down to the American comic book was back in the 1930s and 1940s, oftentimes featured a lot of stories as related to World War II. And many comic book professionals today believe that because there were a lot of comics made during World War II, which had featured Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party being taken on by superheroes like Captain America, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, that this is the motivation for going out here and making these heavily political comics. However, what many of these comic book professionals haven't done is the research on that period in the golden age of comics. Now, as someone who has read comic books from the golden age of comics, like your Captain Americas, like your Submariners, like your Human Torches, and many other comics from the golden age, I understand the artistic statements that these comic pros were making back then, the political statements they were making back then, and the social commentary they were making back then. And when it came down to some of those comics, yes, some of those comics did feature slanted material where they show the superheroes beating up on the Nazis, but that was done again because during that time in American history, we had a heavy pro-America angle as related to publication. So we had people who were making comics that were very pro-America at the time. But they weren't making heavy political statements. What they were doing was making entertainment for children to show how American heroes were going to beat the Axis. Now, some people would see that as propaganda, but it really wasn't propaganda when you take a look at them within the context of American history. Yes, you had an American hero, but again, this was a commentary on the time that many of these comic books were designed, again, to encourage children, and they were also designed to help American people enlist in the military to go fight the war, because Captain America was designed to be an icon of the whole American campaign to help fight the Axis in America and recruit Americans to go do this. Superman was also, a part of this, and Batman as well, and Wonder Woman. They all were taking on the Nazis and showing that we all could work together to take on the evil Axis, like of Adolf Hitler and the Axis powers. But when it comes down to many of the comic pros today, I believe that they have not really done the research on the golden age of comics, nor have they done the research on the history of the comic book. They believe that they can use the comic book medium to make a political statement, and what they don't understand is that there is a fine line between propaganda and social commentary. Now, when it comes down to social commentary, a social commentary makes a statement about the world going on around us at the time, the issues of the time. However, what makes social commentary unique is that social commentary is usually done between the lines of a story, or it's done in between the context of a story. Now, masters of making social commentary were writers like your Ray Bradbury's, your Gene Roddenberry's, and your Rod Serling's. And in order to understand how to make social commentary, you really need to read their books or watch the television shows that people like Gene Roddenberry have produced and written scripts for, like Have Gun, Will Travel, or Star Trek. Or you have to watch something like Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone to really understand how social commentary works. Because when it comes down to shows like your Have Gun, Will Travel, your Star Trek, or your Twilight Zone, they often made their commentary in between the lines of the stories that they were featured in them. And because they were making that social commentary, oftentimes the issue was made, there were statements made about the issue, but it resonated with the viewer because they weren't being preached to, and they weren't being preached to in a heavy-handed fashion. Oftentimes in these stories, like Eye of the Beholder, we got a commentary on women's self-esteem and self-image, or oftentimes in other stories like A Have Gun Will Travel, they'll use the West to make a commentary about modern America, or Star Trek would oftentimes make a commentary on the politics of a time, or how people can become disconnected by going and exploring these different civilizations or these different worlds, which oftentimes went to places which looked like different parts of civilizations from past eras. And again, this was all done to make a social commentary on the world going on around us. And when it comes down to many of these comic pros who are out here today making comics, I believe that they really have not done enough research into the comic book genre, the comic book history of the history of the comic book genre, and they have not really read enough, because I look at many of their comics and I'm clearly seeing that they're not really doing enough research on their subject matter, because oftentimes their subjects that they're exploring in their comics often comes across as propaganda. Now when it comes down to propaganda, propaganda is oftentimes a very slanted story towards one side, often very heavy-handed towards one side, and often presents only the positives of one side of the story. And I was looking at one of these Mockingbird comics, and I saw how slanted it was, and it was like they were making it where this girl was literally denied everything, and they did it within the context of the 1980s. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying to myself, as someone who grew up in the 1980s, I knew that there was opportunity for girls to do all sorts of things at the time. So when I'm looking at this material, it was clear to me that the writer had not done the research of the time period, nor had they did research on the history of things as related to girls and science. Because at the time we had Mae Jemison, who was an astronaut at the time, and we had numerous female scientists at the time. So when they were doing the story, again, it was heavy-handed, and the same thing with the Riri Williams character. They often came across as very heavy-handed and very slanted, and this bias really prevents the reader from really getting to see a balanced picture of the context of the character or the context of the action going on in a story. And that's what propaganda is. Excuse me. Propaganda is extremely slanted towards one side's viewpoint and one side perspective of a subject or an issue. And when it comes down to publishers like your Black Mask or your Marvel or your DC, on certain subjects, they oftentimes present a very propaganda type angle in many of their comics. And that's why many people call them SJW comics, because when it comes down to the SJW, they oftentimes are not presenting you with an objective view in their stories. Now, a storyteller who presents an objective view in their stories knows that they not only have to look at one side of a subject, they also have to look at the other side of the subject. So they're looking at both the pros and the cons, and when they present their story and their subject matter, you can see the objectivity on the page of the story, and you can draw your own conclusions as to what's going on in that story. Now, when I go out here and I'm writing fantasy like a Temptation of John Haynes, I wrote that story, it was, yes, it had Christian themes in it. However, in this story where this man is being tempted by the devil, I also had to present the devil's side of the story and the side of the demon side of the story, the Eastern character, the demon side of the story. So that we not only got the side of the Christian character, John Haynes, but we also got the side from Lucifer and Eastern. And because we got both sides, the reader could make an objective observation regarding the action transpiring and get an understanding of what went on in that story. Now, another story that I went out and wrote called Isis Night of the Vampires also featured objectivity, because I had to not only present the side of the humans and the goddess Isis and John Haynes, but I also had to present the side of the vampire Lilith in the story and the side of the vampire story. So we got both sides of the story, and from that, again, people could make an objective observation of things. And as I continued the vampire arc, I brought in Count Dracula, and we saw his side of the story as related to his reasons for going after John Haynes. And we also saw that in Escape from Transylvania, where we saw Dracula's daughter and her reasons for trying to go after John Haynes and Isis once more. So in all three of the vampire stories, we got a viewpoint not only of the hero and why they were fighting against the vampires and Dracula, but we also got the vampire's view of things. And from both of those sides, we got an objective picture and a clear picture of the entire story, the motivations of the characters, the reasons why they acted, and what the psychology that went on in the story. And this is another thing that's a real big problem with many of these political comics, is that a lot of them are filled with emotion because the writers themselves are coming from an emotional place, and because they're coming from an emotional place, we're not getting an objective picture of things. Now, when I used to read comics back in the day, there was a lot of objectivity in between the pages of the comics. And when I would read those comics, again, you'd see not only the hero side of the story where he was going to stop the bad guy, but you also saw the bad guy's motivation for going out here and committing the crime. And because we saw both sides of the story, we saw a clear picture of the hero, and we saw a clear picture of the villain, and we saw why the hero had to stop the villain. When I look at many modern comics these days, I don't see that kind of objectivity. And again, I don't believe we see that objectivity because when it comes down to many comic writers and many comic pros, they are coming from the position of inexperience. They're coming from the position from a lack of craft. They are coming from a position of not doing enough research on the comic book medium, the storytelling genre, or understanding anything about the craft of storytelling. And they believe that comics are just supposed to be a medium where you make this political statement. However, when it comes down to storytelling, these writers don't really understand the craft of writing, because when you understand the craft of writing, you understand that when you're trying to tell your story, you have to give people a theme and a message, but the message has to be presented in an objective way so that people understand why this was the outcome of the story. Now, when I used to watch things like Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, or I watch Have Gun Will Travel, I began to understand why these characters acted the way they did and why the story had the outcome that it did. And the statement that was made at the end of the story was because the writers understood the world around them and they understood the history of things, and that all again came from their research, and it also came from them understanding their craft. And when again, there's a big difference between social commentary and propaganda, and those writers, because they understood the craft of writing, understood how to write something that made a social commentary on the world around them. And they understood that they could not make their social commentary in the face of people for it to resonate. No, they understood that they had to make their social commentary in between the lines of the story. And many comic pros back in the day understood this as well, because I could look at stories like the Captain America Secret Empire story, which was making a commentary on Richard Nixon to easily see that, yes, they were making a commentary about Richard Nixon and Watergate, but they were using the secret empire to make that commentary about Richard Nixon and Watergate. And I could also see how they were making a commentary on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King's ideologies in the X-Men, because you could clearly see that they were making this commentary, but they did it again in between the lines of the story, not getting in the face of the reader where they were going to try to shove an idea in their face. What they were doing was presenting you with things that were made to give you an idea of things so that you could think about it. But when it comes down to SJW comics or propaganda comics, they don't want you to think. What they really want you to do is feel, and they come from the place of emotion, and they want you to feel about a subject, and they want you to try to convince you that their way is right. And again, that's propaganda, and most people really, they get turned off when they see somebody presenting them with propaganda, because propaganda is heavy-handed, propaganda is one-sided, and propaganda does not give us the opposing view. Whereas social commentary gives us both sides of the story and then lets us come to our own conclusions, and then gives us an overall outcome which lets us understand what needs to be done. And that's something that I learned from when I was learning how to write stories from shows like Your Have Gun Will Travel, The Twilight Zone, and your Star Trek. All the three of those shows, they, as I see it, are something that every comic writer really needs to watch on the regular. And the books by your Gene Roddenberry and your Richard Matheson and and even the scripts of Rod Serling, you really need to take a look at those if you're serious about writing comics, because these are the masters of the craft, and from there you can really learn about writing objective stories and making social commentary. And you also have to take a look at Golden Age comics to understand the political statements made at the time, because when it came down to those comics, they weren't really propaganda. They were really entertainment for children, and it was meant, again, to get people energized about the war and to say that, you know, these are pro-America comics, and the heroes who are Americans are going to do what they can to help out these soldiers during this war. But when it comes down to many of these SJWs, again, they don't really do the research, they really don't study their subject matter, and a lot of them, they're coming into comics, but they really don't understand the medium of comics, again, the history of comics, or the context that many of these stories were featured in. So, as a guy who's been studying comics in his aspirations to become a comic book writer, I have studied, you know, comics from numerous eras. I've studied the history of the comic book medium, and I've also studied science fiction and fantasy. So I understand, you know, where these writers are coming from. I understand the commentary that they make in between the lines of their stories, and I also understand that, you know, when you're writing a story and you want to make that type of commentary, you cannot make a heavy-handed propaganda piece, because when you make a heavy-handed propaganda piece, people are going to see right through it, and then they're going to get alienated because they don't want someone screaming at them. They want somebody who presents them with a fair and balanced argument in between the pages of a comic book, and they want that fair and balanced argument so that they can assess both sides of the story, and then when they see the outcome, they understand where both sides are coming from. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct titles, like The Temptation of John Haynes and the ISIS series, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.